Now, the name of the sermon today is called The Great Escape. Now, there's two reasons why I call the sermon The Great Escape. One of the reasons is because it was. That all the people were able to leave. But the other reason is, in 1963, there was a movie called The Great Escape. It was a really well-made movie. It had all the top male actors of the time. Steve McQueen, James Garner, Charles Bronson, and a list of others. And the movie was about the Second World War story of how these prisoners who had either parachuted into Germany or and been captured. And they were put in a prison camp with other prisoners. But these particular ones always managed to escape. But see, the trick of escaping is not just getting out of the prison camp, it's getting across the ocean into England so that you are safe. But they were all captured again. And so Germany said, we'll fix you, we'll put you in a prison camp that no one can escape from. And they had 250 of these returned, captured and escaped and captured again men. And so they said, we're not just going to escape, all 250 of us are going to escape from this prison. And they started digging tunnels. And there's lots of parts in the movie where you see that they're fooling the prison guards. In one part, they're bringing the mud up that they're digging out of the tunnel. What do you do with it? You can't hide it under your bed. So they had no pocket in their pants. They took the pocket out and they would dump it down their leg and it would fall on the ground. And that's where the mud went. It just kept covering the ground. And so the story is that one of the tunnels were discovered, and so they could only use the other two, and they decided that this is the time, and they popped their head out of the hole where the tunnel was out in the woods. But it wasn't in the woods, it ended early. And now, as soon as the light came around, they could see them. And so they had to be very careful. And only 70 of them got away. And the 71st one, his head was seen when it popped up. And now they knew they'd escaped. And, well, the sad thing is that in spite of all this planning, all but 2 were recaptured, and the 68 that were recaptured were all shot. So, in a way, it's not really a great escape. Only 2 of the 250 got away. It's back to England to tell the story. Well, God had a better idea with this. He said, look, here's all you do. Just ask to leave, and I'll look after all the rest. And that's what happened. They said, let my people go, and God looked after the rest. Now, Moses was the guy that God said, I'm going to get you to let my people go. I'm going to get you to help. And he was an exceptional child. In Exodus 2, verse 2, it says, the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. Now, I may be biased, I'm pretty sure I'm not, but my grandchildren were beautiful. But he must have been an exceptional baby, because if you remember the story, the Israelites were very, the children didn't die, they had lots of children, and the Egyptians were worried. So the plan is, when you have slaves, you want to outnumber the slaves, and all of a sudden the slaves were becoming more numerous than the people of Egypt, and they were worried that if they revolted, we're going to be in a hard place. So they said all the male Egyptians, not Egyptians, the Israelites, the Egyptians said, will have to be thrown in the Nile. So she tried to keep him for 3 months, and then he protested. He said, I want to do God's will. he loudly proclaimed that he wanted to cooperate with God. That's usually called crying in baby terms, but that's what he did, and he was too loud. And so there he was. And so it says in verse 3, she could hide him no longer and got a wicker basket and covered it over with tar and pitch. Then she put the child into it and set it among the reeds on the bank of the Nile. Well, she had to put Moses into the care of God. She had to trust God to look after him. And God did. And you know what happened? The princess, the daughter of Pharaoh, saw this baby boy, and she thought too that he was a beautiful baby, and she adopted him. And 40 years pass, and he's now a prince in Egypt, and he recognizes that I'm an Israelite, and I want to see how my people are doing. In verse 11, it says, now it came about in those days when Moses had grown up, he went out to his brother and looked at their hard labors, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. And you know the story. He killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Now, there's a problem with this. It's a very poor plan. It's gone sideways. I remember there was some advertisements. You know how some advertisements are really good on TV and some are awful, but this one I thought was really well done. And it was how you should get house insurance. How it's important to get house insurance. And it shows this man with one of those cheap whippersnippers that is electric. And you know, they're about this long, and they're not made for a big yard, they're just made for a small yard. And he's got it in his hand. And he hasn't got enough electric cord, so the cord is taut, and he's up to the top step on a ladder, and he's got the thing over his head like this, and there's a hornet's nest about the size of a man's head, and he's going to whippersnip the hornet's nest. Well, this is why you need house insurance, because the hornets are going to go out of the hornet's nest, and they're going to sting him, and he's going to fall off the ladder. Well, this is the plan that Moses had. He hadn't thought it out. He's a prince in Egypt. He could have come up with a way to help them incrementally, but no. He kills an Egyptian. Pharaoh hears and says, I know what's happening. He's going to side with all of these and make a revolt. So off he goes. He goes off to Midian, and he spends 40 years looking after sheep. I sent out my email last night, and I said he went from a shepherd to being a shepherd, because that's what he was when he looked after all these people in the desert. So God meets him there. He sees the burning bush, just like we read about the burning bush, and it isn't consumed. And in the desert, these things happen quite often, where a bush would start to burn. It was really dry, tinder dry, and it would just go up like that. And it wouldn't last any time before it was burnt and gone. But he noticed this one had been burning for a long time. And it was really interesting. Why is this burning for so long? It can't last that long, so I must go look at it. Well, you see, there's something in verse 6 that I think is really interesting. 3 verse 6. He said also, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Then Moses hid his face, and he was afraid to look on God. Now, he had lived 40 years in Egypt. He had looked on all the Egyptian gods. He wasn't scared to look on the gods. People looked at gods all the time. And so why was this different? Well, he realized that there was something special about this God, that even to look on him would risk your life. This is not the God of the Egyptians. This is a different God entirely, on a completely different level, and there's something that I need to be careful about how I address this God. He's told to take off his sandals. He's told not to come near. It's a holy place. Well, God tells him, I've got a job to do. You remember 40 years ago you were going to help the people escape, and well, I'm sending you back. But he spent 40 years with sheep. He says, I have no voice. I don't know how to do this. You need to get somebody else. Please get somebody else. I'd like you to get somebody else. Well, God was not taking that answer. He was not going to. So Moses says, well, if I go back, who will I say is the God that sent me back? In 13, it says, then Moses said to God, behold, I'm going to the sons of Israel, and I will say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. Now, when they say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. He said, thus shall you say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Now, I am who I am. What he's saying is, I pre-existed all of the universe. I don't need anything that man has. I don't need man to name me. I don't need man to worship me. I don't need any of these things. I will allow this, but I am independent of all of this. If you remember later on, Jesus used those same words. That's why they wanted to stone him. Now, you have to realize that no one at that time was an atheist. There was no atheists at that time, and so everyone worshipped some god. But most of the other gods would require things, but God didn't require anything. He was independent of all this. Now, you know what happened. Moses got some signs. His staff would turn into a snake. He put his hand in his coat. It would come out leprous. He put his hand in his coat. It would come out clean. And he still said, look, I haven't got the words. I can't say these things. And God said, Aaron is on his way. He'll speak for you. Now, the fourth point is the mission, should you accept it. Now, you're all probably too young to remember Mission Impossible in 1963 or 64, but it was a great show. And if you remember, the guy would step into the phone booth, he would close the door, and there would be this tiny miniature tape recorder. It was cutting-edge technology then, but it was a little tiny tape recorder, and he pushed the button and it said, this mission, should you accept it? And then it would go on and it would be some amazing thing that would keep your attention for the next half hour. And as soon as it finished, it would self-destruct. Well, the mission, should you accept it, is not the mission for Moses and Aaron. They've already got their mission. The mission is for Pharaoh. The mission is in chapter 5, verse 1. And afterward, Moses and Aaron came and said to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may celebrate a feast to me in the wilderness. But Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and besides, I will not let Israel go. Then they said, the God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. Otherwise, he will fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword. Now, whenever I've read this, I've thought to myself, this is not the plan. The plan is that they're going to go to the land of plenty, a land flowing with milk and honey. The Israelites were promised 430 years ago that God would take them out of Egypt. So what's this plan to go 3 days into the desert? Well, the more I thought about it, the more I said, well, this is not God being deceptive to Pharaoh. This is offering him a legitimate offer. Let my people go into the desert. And Pharaoh could have said, hey, What a great idea. The God of the universe wants you to worship him. You go. Whatever you need, you take with you. And maybe we can do this every year. Or maybe a couple times a year. And maybe we can decide that, but he didn't take that. Pharaoh said, no, I'm not letting your people go. But God knew that all along. And he knew that the Pharaoh and the Egyptians would not let their slaves go. So God put together a group of 10 plagues that basically they destroyed the power of the Egyptian gods. The first one was blood, changed the Nile to blood. Well, they worshiped the Nile. God, in his plagues, said, look, your gods look after this stuff. Well, I'm going to just stomp on it and show you that I'm more powerful than the gods of Egypt. And there's something else you need to recognize. As these plagues were happening, God was saying, let my people go. And the first 3 or 4 were the blood, the frogs, the flies, the gnats, and everybody got those. And in a way, those were kind of inconvenient. They were a real pain. And I don't know what gnats do, but I suspect they're very uncomfortable. And he turned the sand into gnats. And this is what happened. Up until that time, the Egyptian magicians, it says in verse 18, the magicians tried with their secret arts to bring forth gnats, but they could not. So the gnats were on man and beast. In verse 19, then the magician said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them, as the Lord had said. You see, that plague, the Egyptians said, look, we're done. We can't fix this. We can't duplicate this. This is the hand of God. Well, now things are going to change. The next plague is a pestilence on the livestock. And this is what it says in verse 5 of chapter 9. The Lord said verse 4. But the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of Egypt, so that nothing will die that belongs to the sons of Israel. At that point, God said, you've experienced, people of Israel, these plagues. You know that I'm doing them, but from now on, those plagues won't affect you at all. And you can watch Egypt suffer at my hand, but you won't suffer. And these plagues were worse. There was that plague where the livestock died, and then there was hail where people were killed, and there was all sorts of other plagues that didn't touch the people of Israel at all. And it says that Pharaoh hardened his heart. But after the 8th plague, it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart. You see, he had lots of opportunities. This is kind of like where you reap what you sow. He had all these opportunities to say, I will let the people go just exactly as they asked. And he kept putting conditions on God. He said, I'll let the men go, but I won't let the women and the children and the flocks go. You see, God doesn't accept you put conditions on him. He says, this is the way I want you to do it. It's best for you. Well, we come to the last plague. The 11th. Exodus 11. Now, as I said, Pharaoh had many chances, one after another, and he wasted them. In the last plague, it says in chapter 11, verse 1, now the Lord said to Moses, one more plague I will bring on Pharaoh and on Egypt. After that, he will let you go from here. When he lets you go, he will surely drive you out from here completely. You see, originally, he said, look, let my people go 3 days into the wilderness. They'll worship me. We'll come back. We'll be happy slaves. But at this point, Pharaoh and the people of Egypt are saying, just go or we'll all die. And the reason they say that is because of Passover. Now you know what Passover was. God said to the people, the last 5 plagues, I have protected you from them. You didn't get the hail, you didn't get the pestilence, you didn't get any of these other ones. But this one, you need to do something in order for me to protect you. This is where God came down from the upper story to the lower story and said, I'm going to make something for you to remember for all time until Jesus comes. This is one of those pictures of how I'm going to save the people. And so he said, I want you to take a lamb, a perfect lamb, and I want you to kill it and take the blood and paint it on the doorpost and over the lintel. And when I come, you will be safe. But everyone, all the Egyptians around you will lose their firstborn child. And you're to dress in your clothes, and you're to stand up, and you're to cook this lamb, and you're to eat it, and be ready to leave. Because once this happens, they're going to tell you to leave immediately. And God says, I've purchased your firstborn. With this miracle, I've purchased them. And later on, he trades them in. It says in 13, verse 1 and 2. Chapter 13, verse. The Lord said to Moses, saying, sanctify to me every firstborn, the first offspring of every womb among the sons of Israel, both man and beast, it belongs to me. Now, later on, they had a census, and they counted all the people, and all the firstborn they counted. And there was an exact number of all the male men of the Levite, and God says, I'm going to trade you all your firstborn that would belong to me, and you give me the Levite tribe, they'll serve me forever. Well, you know what happened. They went off into the desert, and they got to the Red Sea. And when they got to the Red Sea, they kind of stopped. And in chapter 14, verse 21, it says, Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord swept the sea back by a powerful east wind. All night he turned the sea into dry land, so the waters were divided. The sons of Israel went through the midst of the sea on dry land. And the waters were like a wall to them on the right hand and on the left. Now, this is another one of those pictures where God is saying, the Israelites went into the sea as sinners, and they came out. They went in as slaves, they come out as free people. It's the picture of us being baptized. A picture of us going into the water as sinners and coming out washed clean. Now, we know that baptism doesn't save us. It's another picture. God has made the ordinance of baptism and the ordinance of communion as pictures for us so that we will remember how he saved us, how he washed us with his blood and made us clean. Every one of these stories, pictures from the Bible, are stories where God has shown us that he comes down and he changes from the upper story to our lower story, and he makes it so that we understand that he cares. He's going to change us. The Passover lamb is just a picture of Jesus coming thousands of years later as the lamb that taketh away the sins of the world. The trip through the Red Sea is a picture of us being baptized. We go into the water, slaves to sin, and we come out free. And if you remember what happened to the Egyptians, in verse 27, so Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal state at daybreak, while the Egyptians were fleeing right into it. Then the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. What happened is the Hebrews went into the sea, and the Egyptians who were chasing them never came back out. The next verse says, they looked on the entire army was gone in the sea after them, and they saw them washed up on the bank. Verse 30 says they washed up on the seashore. You see, our sins, God removes them from as far as the east is from the west. When God says, I'm going to do this, he does it in such a way that it's complete and finished. Now, God wanted everyone in the ancient world to watch this happen and see this and understand that God was the one that rescued the Egyptians, the Israelites from the Egyptians. He wanted everyone to be clear about this. And he wants everyone to read the Bible and read the story of Jesus dying on the cross and rising again in such a way that we understand that God did this. God did this to save us. Now, if you think that, well, that's, I wonder where I remember this. This reminds me of something. And if it does, it reminds you of Stephen in chapter 7 of Acts. Stephen went through this whole thing just the same. See, Stephen was being accused because he had such a Spirit of God that no one could argue with him. They accused him of blaspheming Moses and God. So his sermon was the story, included the story of Moses perfectly. Everything I said, he said better. And at the end he said in verse 52 of chapter 7, which one of the prophets did your father not persecute? They killed those who previously announced the coming of the righteous one, whose betrayers and murderers you have become. God, through Stephen, spoke to these people once again and said, you see this picture? This picture is me saving you. This picture is Jesus. And you had the opportunity to come to Jesus and you killed him. So we all of us have this opportunity to come to Jesus and recognize that God has done a marvelous, miraculous work of grace to save us from our sins. He did this over and over through the Old Testament in pictures so that we could see when it happened, wait a minute, I recognize that picture. I recognize that Passover lamb. I recognize all of those things. It's time maybe I listened to God and accepted his son Jesus. Let's pray.